Dispensationalism Before Darby by William Watson. It's crazy repetitive and mind-numbingly boring at times, but that's why it's so important. Dispensationalism Before Darby traces the history of dispensationalist teaching from the time of Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, when he nailed those 95 theses to the church door at Wittenberg at the beginning of the 16th century, up until the mid-19th century and the beginning of the teaching ministry of Darby. One of the most common attacks against dispensationalism today is that it's relatively recent, that it was started in the ministry of Darby, and so we should reject it today as something that the early church fathers and the medieval church never believed. But before I go on and talk about the book anymore, I first want to answer the question, what is dispensationalism? Dispensationalism takes a historical grammatical interpretation of the Bible. That means that the reader of the Bible is to understand all of the passages in a normal fashion without allegorizing or spiritualizing texts unless the author leads us down that road. Therefore, dispensationalists distinguish between Israel and the church. We also believe that God worked with men different during different ages or dispensations of human history. Dispensationalists believe in a future tribulation, millennial kingdom, and new heaven and new earth as described in Revelation. In a work that is both thorough and repetitive, William Watson shows that so many pastors held to dispensationalist views from the launch of the Reformation up until the days of Darby. So there was nothing really original in Darby's work at all. There were many men who taught the same thing in the centuries leading up to his ministry. Now, I don't recommend this book for light reading. It is mostly a collection of quotations that tread the same ground again and again, but this repetition is needed to prove the point of this book, that there was a widespread group of people who held dispensationalist teaching before the time of John Darby. So I think every dispensationalist pastor should have this book on their shelf for reference. Anyone who is an outspoken defender of dispensationalism needs to read this book. I would also encourage anybody who just outright dismisses dispensationalism as something that is a recent modern invention of the church to check out Watson's work and to see how dispensationalist views were not original with Darby, but he was simply teaching what other men had taught during the years before him. My favorite quote in the book is about the teaching ministry of a seminary professor by the name of Johann Alstedt. Johann saw the events of the 30-year war as the Great Tribulation, which would precede the coming of the Messiah and 1,000 years of peace. This is my favorite quote. This is my favorite quote because it serves as an illustration of what has clearly been and continues to be one of the great weaknesses of dispensationalism. And that is the desire to interpret any current events as something in the end times. Again and again, Watson brings out the sad truth that pastor and teacher after pastor and teacher and seminary professors and theologians all tried to predict when Jesus Christ would come back, be it in 1670 or 1786 or 1830. Two guys actually predicted 2015, and the latest out of all the dates was Isaac Newton's 2060. Now in the church, we desperately want Jesus to come back. But that does not mean that every conquest in the Middle East, every sneeze that is in Israel is a sign that Jesus is coming back in the next 2 years. Dispensationalists Before Darby allows dispensationalists to see the long history of our views and our interpretation of Scripture, but then cautions us from going beyond what is written in Scripture. This is an important, and I would even say for dispensationalists, this is a monumental work.